In this video, I will give a conference paper I will be delivering at Vagantes on April 9th, and I wanted to share it with you early. The argument is about how the author of the Chronica Adefonsi Imperatoris, a 12th century Leonese-Castilian chronicle, represented Muslims in Islam, with genuine political precision on one hand, and deliberate theological distortion on the other. If you watch to the end, I would love to hear from you in the comments. If something did not land clearly, let me know. And if something caught your attention or sparked a question, tell me what it was. Here it is. In the middle of the 12th century, a Christian author writing in Leon Castile produced a chronicle of war and lordship that is remarkable for what it knew and for what it refused to know. The Chronica Adefonsi Imperatoris, the CAI, distinguished the Almoravids from the Almohads and Andalusi Muslims from Amazigh conquerors from North Africa. Its author grasped the political landscape of Al-Andalus with real precision, and yet, when he described what Muslims believed, how they prayed, and what their mosques represented, he relied almost entirely on inherited Christian categories that had almost nothing to do with Islam as it was actually practiced. That gap was not unusual for his age. John Toland has shown that the 12th century was precisely the moment when Latin writers began to learn more about Islam through trade, crusade, and the intellectual life of the Iberian frontier, and that this new knowledge did not produce more accurate representation of Muslim belief. What it produced instead was a more learned mode of distortion. The chronicler of the CAI belonged to this same intellectual moment, but with a significant difference. He was not writing a theological refutation. He was writing a chronicle of war and lordship, and his distortions were not argued, but assumed, embedded in the narrative structure of the text itself. As David Nuremberg has argued, increased proximity to religious others is as capable of heightening polemical forms as it is of dissolving them. The chronicler was not simply confused about Islam. He was actively assimilating it into the categories drawn from Scripture and inherited polemic, and doing so with considerable precision and purpose. My argument, then, is this. The Chronica Adefonsi Imperatoris combined advancing political familiarity with Islam with deliberate theological distortion, organizing both into a biblical hierarchy that structured its entire portrayal of alliance, enmity, and divine favor. I want to move through 4 dimensions of this. The chronicler's naming system for the Islamic world, the individual rulers who give those names moral flesh, his deliberate misreading of Islamic worship, and finally, what conduct after battle reveals about his theological argument. Turning now to the naming system, the first thing to notice about this chronicle is that it refused to treat Muslims as a single, undifferentiated group. Most Latin Christian writers of this period relied on broad generic labels: Saracens, pagans, Moors, barbarians. The author of the CAI used those labels too, but he went considerably further. He divided the Islamic world into distinct peoples, each designated by a specific Old Testament name, each name corresponding to a real political and ethnic group active in Al-Andalus and the Maghreb. These were not arbitrary choices. Each name carried what I would call a moral script, a built-in narrative of how that people would behave, what role they would play in the providential drama, and how their story would end. The scripts were not equal. Iberian Muslims, the indigenous Andalusi population, were called Hagarenes, Agareni, after Hagar and Ishmael, whose descendants were placed outside the covenant by Christian exegesis, yet still promised a great nation by God. That ambiguity mattered. It left open the possibility, however narrow, of loyalty and partial redemption, as we will see in the figure of Zafadola. The Almoravids received the label Moabites after King Eglon in Judges, the archetype of the oppressive foreign ruler who grows fat on a subject people's wealth until divine judgment overturns him. The chronicler narrated the Almoravid dynastic collapse with precisely this kind of grim, foreordained precision. The Almohads stood in a different category altogether, labeled Assyrians after the imperial power God raised up to devastate Israel. Their campaigns in the Chronicle were marked by the massacre of civilians, the burning of fields and towns, a violence directed not merely at soldiers, but at the land itself. They were something beyond ordinary enemies, a scourge in the biblical sense, raised up by God to punish, and recognizable as such by the sheer scale of their destruction. The chroniclers still reached for Saracens or Moors when precision did not matter, which makes the typological vocabulary all the more deliberate when it appears. He was not failing to understand the Islamic world. He was choosing to render it in biblical terms, assigning each Muslim people a place in a providential order whose outcome Scripture had already determined and whose contours mapped precisely onto the world he saw around him. Those typological categories became most legible when attached to individual rulers. The contrast between Zafadollah, a Hagarian king who became vassal of Alfonso VII, and Ali ibn Yusuf, the Almoravid emir, showed what the naming system looked like when embodied in actual people. Zafadollah was the chronicler's example of what a Hagarian could be at his best. When Almoravid pressure threatened his position, he urged his followers to seek Alfonso's protection, and the chronicler gave him a remarkable speech. Quote, "I know that he will rule over the land of the Saracens, because God in heaven is his deliverer, and God on high is his help." End quote. The chronicler did not present this as political calculation. He presented it as perception of divine truth. A Muslim king, outside the covenant, nonetheless recognized where God's favor had fallen. He embodied the conviction that certain Hagarians could align themselves with Christian order and participate in Alfonso's divinely guided mission. Ali ibn Yusuf stood at the opposite end of this moral spectrum. Andalusi rebels denounced him in the language drawn directly from Scripture, accusing the Moabites of eating the fat of the land, seizing gold and silver, and oppressing wives and children. His siege of Toledo collapsed after 7 days. His armies fled. The chronicler described him with a consistent vocabulary of emotional disorder. He grew angry, he feared, he was troubled, he despaired, and then he retreated to North Africa. These were not merely character flaws. These were signs of a man whose dynasty had already forfeited divine support. When Ali's son and heir Tashfin died, Book 2, Chapter 105 tells us that the Hagarians were overjoyed. The most revealing passages in the Chronicle are not battle scenes, but the moments when the chronicler tried to describe what Muslims actually believed and how they prayed. Here, his political sophistication gave way to something more deliberate, a systematic reframing of Islamic worship through Christian categories of error. In Book 2, Chapter 93, the chronicler wrote, and I want to read this in Latin because the precision matters, "Orabant petentes miserationes Mahometis, pseudo prophete eorum." They prayed, seeking the mercies of Muhammad, their pseudo-prophet. He depicted Muslims directing their prayers to Muhammad himself, asking him for mercy, as though he were an intercessor analogous to Christ or the saints. This was not a careless mistake. A writer who understood Almoravid dynastic policies well enough to narrate the succession from Ali ibn Yusuf to Tashfin ibn Ali was not simply ignorant about how Muslims prayed. He was placing Muhammad in the role that Christian typology had already prepared for the false prophet, the one who mimics divine mediation while leading his followers away from it. This same logic governed his treatment of sacred space. Consistently throughout the Chronicle, mosques were called synagogae. In one passage, the chronicler referred to a mosque explicitly as a, quote, synagogue of Satan, end quote. In the Great Guadalquivir raid of Book 2, Chapter 36, Alfonso's forces, quote, destroyed the synagogues and burned the books of the law of Muhammad, end quote. The term synagoga did not simply misidentify a mosque. It folded Islamic worship into a polemical category familiar from the New Testament, one associated with the rejection of Christ and the persistence of error. Muslim scholars were labeled sacerdotes, priests, and doctores legis, teachers of the law, titles drawn from Christian clerical hierarchies. The imprecision was deliberate. Islam was assimilated into a pre-existing taxonomy of deficient worship rather than described on its own terms, even as Muslim leaders in battle were rendered with far greater specificity. The chronicle's moral argument extended into conduct after battle. 3 scenes involving Muñoz Alfonso made the contrast explicit. Muñoz was one of Alfonso VII's most celebrated commanders, and Alcaide, the military governor of Toledo. In Book 2, Chapter 69, outnumbered and expecting defeat, he addressed Christ directly, calling on Mary and St. James to defend him. The intercession moved through the proper Christian hierarchy. Miraculously, he won. After the battle, his forces displayed the heads of defeated Muslim kings on spears, as was customary. But Muñoz then ordered their bodies wrapped in fine silk and guarded until they could be collected. A few days later, the Empress Berengaria had the heads anointed with myrrh and aloes, placed in caskets of gold and silver, and sent with honor to Córdoba to be returned to the king's families. The contrast emerged most sharply in Muñoz's own death. The Calatravan commander, or Adalid, Farax, cut off his head, his right arm and shoulder, his right foot and leg, stripped the armor, and sent the head on a public circuit through Córdoba, Sevilla, and across the sea to Marrakech. His limbs and the heads of other fallen Christian knights were fastened to a tower at Calatrava. Muñoz's body was not returned, as the Muslim king's bodies had been. Christian restraint and mercy reflected divine order. Almoravid mutilation revealed moral corruption. Victory alone did not separate the two sides. What each side did, with victory showed, in the chronicler's telling, which people belonged to God's order and which did not. The Chronica Adefonsi Imperatoris gives us a view from inside the moment when Latin Christians were learning to distinguish among Muslim polities without producing more accurate representations of Muslim belief. Its author grasped the political landscape of Al-Andalus and even events in North Africa with real precision. But knowledge of religious others and fair representation of their faiths are not the same thing. The chronicler's misrepresentation of Islamic belief was not simply a matter of ignorance, though ignorance surely played its part. Latin Christian writers had inherited centuries of polemical tropes about Muslim worship, and the chronicler drew on that tradition freely. But where he possessed genuine political knowledge, he still chose biblical framing over accurate depiction. The distortion was not only received, it was also purposeful. He rendered Islam into biblical terms because those terms gave his narrative its coherence, its moral stakes, and its providential logic. Zafadola appeared as the loyal Hagarine, Ali as the collapsing Moabite, Abd al-Mumin as the Almohad Assyrian invader. Mosques became synagogues of error. Muhammad became a false intercessor. Christian victories became visible confirmations of divine favor. These were not failures of comprehension. They were interpretive choices, and they served a clear purpose: to transform the messy frontier world of 12th century Iberia into a continuation of sacred history. The CAI is not a record of confusion. It is a record of how a sophisticated mind organized religious difference in the service of a theological argument, and why that argument still felt necessary, even when the political facts made a more complicated picture available.